around the year 1200 BCE, across the eastern Mediterranean, powerful cities that had stood for centuries began to disappear. Palaces burned. Trade routes collapsed. Kingdoms that had dominated the ancient world suddenly vanished from the historical record. Within the span of only a few decades, entire civilizations fell into chaos. Historians today call this moment the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic turning points in ancient history. Welcome, and thank you for joining this long historical journey. In this episode, we will follow the events that led to the sudden collapse of the late Bronze Age world. Step by step, we will explore the rise of powerful civilizations, such as the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, the kingdoms of Canaan, and the vast trade networks connecting them to Egypt and Mesopotamia. We will examine how these societies depended on international trade, bronze production, and complex political alliances that linked the entire eastern Mediterranean into a single interconnected system. Then we will follow the chain of events that began destabilizing that system. Archaeological evidence shows waves of destruction across cities such as Ugarit, Hattusa, and many Mycenaean centers in Greece. Written records from Egypt describe mysterious invaders, known as the Sea Peoples, groups that appeared suddenly along the Mediterranean coast during this same period. At the same time, evidence points to drought, internal rebellions, and disruptions in long-distance trade networks. This raises an important historical question. How could so many powerful civilizations collapse almost at the same time? Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Sleep Tide if you enjoy long-com explorations of ancient history. And leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm always curious to see how far these historical journeys travel across the world. Also share your thoughts on this question. Which ancient civilization from the Bronze Age fascinates you the most? Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, or another culture? Now let's begin by stepping back several centuries before the collapse, when the Bronze Age world was at its height, and powerful kingdoms across the Mediterranean were connected through trade, diplomacy, and shared technologies. Before the disasters of the 12th century BC, the eastern Mediterranean was home to a network of powerful and highly organized civilizations. For several centuries, these kingdoms had built cities, managed large agricultural systems, and maintained diplomatic relationships that connected regions separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. This interconnected world is often referred to by historians as the Late Bronze Age system, a period when political alliances, trade networks, and shared technologies linked many societies into a surprisingly unified international landscape. Among the most powerful of these civilizations was Egypt, ruled during this time by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. Egyptian rulers such as Ramesses II governed a vast and wealthy state centered along the Nile River. Egypt possessed strong agricultural foundations, monumental architecture, and an organized bureaucracy capable of managing large populations. Egyptian armies also maintained influence in territories to the northeast, including parts of the Levant, where important trade routes passed between Africa and Asia. To the north of these Egyptian territories lay the powerful Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey. The Hittites controlled large regions of land and maintained a formidable military that used chariots as a key component of warfare. Their capital, city Hattusa, was heavily fortified and served as the administrative center of a kingdom that rivaled Egypt in both strength and political influence. Diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian and Hittite rulers reveals a world in which major powers negotiated treaties, arranged royal marriages, and exchanged gifts in order to maintain political balance. Further west, across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean civilization dominated mainland Greece and many surrounding islands. The Mycenaeans built fortified palace centers such as Mycenaeans and Pylos, where kings governed regional territories supported by agricultural production and maritime trade. Archaeological discoveries showed that these palaces served as administrative hubs where scribes recorded economic activities using an early writing system known as Linear B. These records document inventories of livestock, grain, textiles, and weapons, demonstrating how carefully organized these palace economies had become. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast, a network of smaller but strategically important city-states flourished. One of the most notable was Ugarit, a prosperous trading city located in what is now modern Syria. Ugarit's position along major trade routes allowed it to act as a hub connecting several different civilizations. Ships arrived in its harbors, carrying goods from Cyprus, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Aegean world. From these ports, merchants distributed materials across inland trade routes that reached deep into Mesopotamia. The economies of these civilizations depended heavily on long-distance exchange. One of the most important materials traded across this network was bronze, the metal alloy that gave the era its name. Bronze was produced by combining copper with tin, but these materials were rarely found in the same locations. Copper was commonly mined in places such as Cyprus, while tin often had to be transported from distant regions, possibly as far away as Central Asia. Because of this geographic separation, maintaining stable trade routes was essential for producing weapons, tools, and everyday items used throughout the Bronze Age world. Diplomatic letters discovered in Egyptian and Near Eastern archives reveal how closely these kingdoms interacted. Rulers exchanged messages discussing trade agreements, requests for precious materials, and concerns about regional security. These documents showed that the late Bronze Age world functioned almost like an early international system in which powerful states maintained communication and cooperation across vast distances. Hittite's Adedi's this interconnected network appeared stable and prosperous. Powerful kings ruled fortified cities. Trade ships crossed the Mediterranean, and diplomatic alliances linked distant regions. Yet this system depended on delicate balances, stable trade routes, reliable agricultural production, and political cooperation between major powers. In the next act, we begin examining the first signs that this system was starting to weaken, and how small disruptions gradually began pushing the Bronze Age world toward a sudden and dramatic collapse. At first glance, the late Bronze Age world appeared stable and prosperous. Powerful kingdoms controlled large territories. Trade ships moved constantly across the Mediterranean, and diplomatic letters connected rulers separated by vast distances. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, the entire system depended on a delicate balance of resources, alliances, and transportation networks, because the major civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean had become deeply interconnected. Disruptions in one region could quickly affect many others. One of the most important foundations of this system was international trade. Bronze production required both copper and tin, two metals rarely found in the same place. Copper was abundant in places such as Cyprus, which became one of the most important suppliers of this metal in the Bronze Age. Tin, however, came from much farther away. Scholars believe it may have been transported from regions in Central Asia, Anatolia, or possibly even farther east through long chains of trade routes. This meant that weapons, tools, and agricultural equipment used across the Mediterranean depended on a complex supply network stretching across continents. In addition to metals, many other goods circulated within this trade system. Merchants transported grain, olive oil, wine, textiles, ivory, precious stones, and luxury items between cities and kingdoms. Archaeological discoveries such as the famous Ulubiran shipwreck, found off the coast of modern Turkey, provide a remarkable snapshot of this network in action. The ship carried cargo from many different regions, including copper ingots from Cyprus, glass beads, ivory, and luxury goods that likely belonged to royal or elite merchants. This single vessel illustrates how trade connected cultures across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Diplomatic relationships helped maintain these trade networks. Kings exchanged letters and gifts as part of a system of alliances designed to prevent conflict and encourage cooperation. Some of these letters have survived in archives discovered at sites such as Amarna in Egypt, where tablets record correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and rulers of neighboring kingdoms. In these messages, kings addressed each other as brother, reflecting a diplomatic tradition that emphasized mutual respect between powerful states. However, this system had an important weakness. It depended on long-distance stability. If trade routes were disrupted, essential materials such as tin could become difficult to obtain. Without tin, bronze production would slow, affecting both military strength and agricultural productivity. Similarly, if political conflicts or environmental changes interrupted shipping routes, entire economies could suffer. Another source of vulnerability came from the centralized nature of palace economies. In many Bronze Age societies, economic activity was organized around large administrative centers controlled by kings or ruling elites. Palaces stored agricultural products, coordinated labor, and managed trade exchanges. This system functioned effectively when leadership remained stable and communication between regions continued smoothly. But if a palace administration collapsed, the economic network surrounding it could quickly break down. Evidence from archaeological excavations suggests that some cities began experiencing difficulties even before the major collapses of the 12th century BCE. Certain trade routes show signs of reduced activity, and some urban centers appear to have suffered localized destruction or abandonment. These early disruptions may not have seemed catastrophic at first, but they indicate that the interconnected system of the Late Bronze Age was becoming increasingly fragile. The importance of this fragility becomes clear when we consider how tightly linked these civilizations had become. A disruption affecting trade in one region could ripple outward across the entire Mediterranean network. If several disruptions occurred at the same time, the system might struggle to recover. In the next part, we examine environmental evidence suggesting that climate changes and drought may have placed additional pressure on these already vulnerable societies. While political alliances and trade networks connected the civilizations of the Late Bronze Age, their stability also depended heavily on environmental conditions. Agriculture remained the foundation of every major society in the Eastern Mediterranean. Kingdoms relied on consistent harvests to support urban populations, feed armies, and maintain economic exchange. When agricultural production declined, the effects could spread rapidly through political and economic systems that were already under strain. In recent decades, archaeological and climate research has produced evidence suggesting that parts of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced significant drought conditions during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Studies of ancient pollen samples, lake sediments, and tree rings indicate periods of reduced rainfall across several regions, including Anatolia, the Levant, and areas of Greece. Although climate patterns varied from place to place, these findings suggest that many agricultural societies were facing increasingly difficult growing conditions around the same time. For civilizations that depended on predictable harvest cycles, even a few years of drought could create serious problems. Reduced rainfall meant smaller grain yields, which could lead to food shortages in cities that relied on surrounding farmland. Palace administrations that normally collected surplus crops from farmers might suddenly find their storage facilities empty. Without enough grain reserves, governments struggled to supply both the population and the armies that defended their territories. Historical texts from the Late Bronze Age provide hints that food shortages were becoming a concern in some regions. Letters discovered in archives from the city of Ugarit, for example, mention requests for shipments of grain during times of need. In one surviving message, a ruler urgently asks for food supplies to help his people survive a crisis. This kind of correspondence suggests that shortages were already affecting certain communities before the wider collapse unfolded. Drought could also affect political stability in other ways. When food supplies declined, rural populations sometimes migrated in search of more fertile land or more reliable water sources. These movements could create tension along borders between kingdoms, especially if large groups of people began entering territories already struggling to support their own populations. In extreme situations, These migrations could contribute to conflict or social unrest. Agricultural stress also placed pressure on the trade networks that supported the Bronze Age economy. Cities that normally exported grain or other agricultural products might suddenly become dependent on imports. This increased demand could strain existing trade routes and create competition between kingdoms seeking limited resources. If multiple regions experienced poor harvests at the same time, the entire network of exchange could become unstable. The situation becomes even more serious when environmental stress is combined with political and military tensions. A kingdom facing food shortages might struggle to maintain its army or defend its borders. Internal unrest could weaken central authority, making it easier for rival powers or invading groups to challenge the existing order. In this way, environmental pressures could act as a catalyst that intensified other problems already developing within the Bronze Age system. Although drought alone cannot explain the collapse of multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean, it likely contributed to the overall instability of the period. Agricultural stress, population movements, and resource shortages created conditions that made societies more vulnerable to additional disruptions. In the next part, we examine how internal political conflicts and rebellions may have further weakened Bronze Age kingdoms during the years leading up to the collapse. While environmental pressures may have strained agricultural production and trade, the political structures of the late Bronze Age kingdoms were also beginning to show signs of internal stress. Many of these societies were built around centralized palace systems, where kings and ruling elites controlled large portions of economic and political life. Palaces organized agricultural labor, managed trade exchanges, and stored food supplies that supported urban populations. This centralized structure could function efficiently during periods of stability, but it also meant that the entire system depended heavily on strong leadership and reliable administration. When internal conflicts emerged, the effects could spread quickly through the palace economy. Rival factions within royal courts sometimes competed for influence, particularly during transitions of power. If a king died or a political authority weakened, competing elites could struggle for control over government institutions. These disputes could interrupt administrative operations, delay decision-making, and weaken the coordination necessary to maintain irrigation systems, military defense, and trade agreements. Evidence from some archaeological sites suggests that internal disturbances may have occurred within certain cities before their final destruction. At several Mycenaean palace centers in Greece, layers of rebuilding and defensive fortifications indicate periods of tension and insecurity during the late 13th century BCE. Some scholars believe that these changes reflect concerns about possible attacks or political instability within the region. Although it is difficult to determine the exact causes of these disturbances, they suggest that the palace administrations were facing increasing pressure even before the broader collapse unfolded. Political instability could also arise from the growing economic inequality within Bronze Age societies. Palace systems controlled large amounts of agricultural land and resources, while ordinary farmers and laborers often depended on these institutions for access to food and employment. During periods of economic strain, such as poor harvests or disrupted trade, tensions between ruling elites and local populations could increase. In some cases, these tensions may have contributed to rebellions or uprisings against established authorities. Written records from the late Bronze Age hint at these kinds of internal difficulties. Some letters between rulers mention concerns about unrest in certain regions or difficulties maintaining control over distant territories. Although these references are often brief, they reveal that political stability was not always guaranteed. Maintaining authority across large kingdoms required constant effort, and any disruption could weaken the overall system. The structure of international diplomacy also contributed to the fragility of the late Bronze Age world. Alliances between major powers, Ugarit, the Hittite Empire, and various Near Eastern kingdoms, were designed to maintain balance across the region. However, if one of these major states became unstable, the diplomatic system could quickly unravel. Smaller kingdoms that relied on protection from powerful allies might suddenly find themselves vulnerable to external threats. These internal challenges created conditions in which even minor disruptions could escalate into larger crises. A weakened kingdom facing drought, food shortages, or political conflict might struggle to defend its borders or maintain trade relationships. If several kingdoms experienced similar difficulties at the same time, the entire network connecting the Eastern Mediterranean could begin to break apart. In the next part, we examine the appearance of a mysterious group mentioned in ancient Egyptian records, people who would become known as the Sea Peoples, whose movements across the Mediterranean coincided with the destruction of several Bronze Age cities, as environmental pressures, economic disruptions, and political tensions began weakening the late Bronze Age world. Another development appeared in the historical record that has captured the attention of historians for more than a century. In Egyptian inscriptions from the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, rulers describe encounters with groups of foreign warriors arriving from across the Mediterranean. These groups are collectively referred to in modern scholarship as the Sea Peoples. The primary evidence for these groups comes from inscriptions and relief carvings created during the reigns of Egyptian pharaohs, such as Merneptah and Ramses III. These records describe large movements of people arriving along the eastern Mediterranean coast, sometimes traveling with families and possessions. Egyptian texts suggest that these groups attacked coastal regions and attempted to enter Egyptian territory. In response, Egyptian armies fought several defensive battles to prevent them from advancing into the Nile Delta. One of the most detailed accounts appears in the inscriptions of Ramses III, who ruled Egypt in the early 12th century BCE. According to these records, the Sea Peoples had already devastated several regions before confronting Egyptian forces. The inscriptions describe entire kingdoms being overrun and cities destroyed as these groups moved through Anatolia and the Levant. Although Egyptian inscriptions often emphasize the victories of their rulers, they provide important clues about the broader disruptions taking place across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from several cities supports the idea that widespread destruction occurred during this period. Sites such as Ugarit, a major trading center along the Syrian coast, show clear signs of violent destruction around the same time these events are described in Egyptian texts. Excavations at Ugarit uncovered letters written shortly before the city's destruction, including messages requesting military assistance against approaching enemies. These documents suggest that the city's leaders were aware of an impending threat but were unable to prevent the disaster that followed. The identity of the Sea Peoples remains one of the most debated topics in ancient history. Egyptian records mention several different groups within this larger movement, including names such as the Shudan, Palasa, and many scholars have proposed many possible origins for these groups, ranging from regions of the Aegean Sea to parts of Anatolia or the central Mediterranean. Some theories suggest that they may have been displaced populations moving in search of new land during a time of environmental stress and political instability. It is important to note that the Sea Peoples alone cannot fully explain the collapse of the Bronze Age world. While they may have contributed to the destruction of certain cities, the broader collapse involved many interconnected factors: environmental pressures, internal conflicts, economic disruptions, and larger-scale migrations all appear to have played roles in destabilizing the region. The Sea Peoples may have been one element within a much larger chain of events, affecting multiple civilizations simultaneously. What makes their appearance particularly significant is the timing. The attacks described in Egyptian records occurred during the same decades when many major Bronze Age cities were destroyed or abandoned. The coincidence of these events suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean was experiencing a period of widespread upheaval unlike anything that had occurred for centuries. In the next act, we followed the destruction of several major Bronze Age civilizations and examined how cities that had stood for generations were suddenly abandoned or burned. By the early 12th century BC, the effects of instability across the Eastern Mediterranean were becoming impossible to ignore. Trade networks were weakening, migrations were increasing, and several cities along the coast had already been destroyed. One of the most dramatic examples of this collapse occurred in Anatolia, where the powerful Hittite Empire, one of the major superpowers of the late Bronze Age, suddenly disappeared from the historical record. For centuries, The Hittites had ruled a vast territory centered around their capital city, Hattusa. Located in what is now central Turkey, the empire had been strong enough to rival Egypt in both military power and diplomatic influence. Its rulers maintained alliances with neighboring states, negotiated treaties with foreign kings, and controlled important trade routes connecting Anatolia with the Levant and Mesopotamia. The famous Battle of Kadesh, fought between the Hittites and Egypt during the 13th century BCE, demonstrates how powerful the Hittite state had become. Yet, by around 1200 BCE, this once dominant empire began to unravel. Archaeological evidence shows that the capital city of Hattusa was abandoned and burned. Excavations at the site reveal destruction layers and signs that the population left the city rather than rebuilding it. Administrative records and inscriptions that once documented the activities of the Hittite state abruptly cease. Within only a few decades, one of the largest political powers in the ancient Near East had vanished. The reasons behind the fall of the Hittite Empire remain a subject of ongoing research. Some scholars believe that internal political struggles may have weakened the state before its final collapse. Managing a large empire required constant coordination between regional governors, military leaders, and the royal court. If communication between these authorities broke down, the stability of the entire political system could quickly deteriorate. Environmental pressures may also have contributed to the crisis. As mentioned earlier, evidence suggests that parts of Anatolia experienced periods of drought during the late 13th century BCE. Because the Hittite kingdom depended on agricultural production from surrounding territories, reduced harvests could have created food shortages that strained the empire's ability to support its population and armies. At the same time, external threats appear to have increased. Archaeological findings from regions near the Hittite borders indicate movements of new groups and possible attacks from neighboring peoples. Some historians suggest that migrating populations from the west or south may have contributed to the destruction of several settlements during this period. Whatever the exact combination of causes, the disappearance of the Hittite Empire represents one of the most dramatic events of the Bronze Age collapse. Within a short period of time, a state that had dominated Anatolia for centuries ceased to exist as a unified political power. Smaller kingdoms and local groups soon replaced the imperial administration that had once governed the region. The fall of the Hittites was only one part of a much larger pattern. During the same decades, other major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean were experiencing similar disruptions. In the next part, we turn our attention westward to the Mycenaean world of Greece, where powerful palace centers also began to collapse around the same time. While the Hittite Empire was disappearing in Anatolia, another powerful civilization was facing a similar fate across the Aegean Sea. For several centuries, the Mycenaean Greeks had dominated mainland Greece and many nearby islands. Their society was organized around fortified palace centers such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes. From these palaces, rulers managed agricultural production, organized trade, and coordinated military forces. The system had developed into a complex administrative network, supported by scribes who recorded economic activities using a writing system known as linear B. Archaeological excavations show that these palace centers were highly organized. Storage rooms contained large quantities of grain, oil, and other agricultural goods collected from surrounding farmland. Workshops produced pottery, textiles, and bronze weapons that were distributed through trade networks extending across the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans also built impressive defensive walls around many of their cities, suggesting that military protection was considered essential for maintaining stability. Despite this apparent strength, signs of trouble began appearing during the late 13th century BCE. Several Mycenaean cities started reinforcing their defenses, constructing new fortifications or expanding existing walls. These efforts suggest that the rulers of these cities were preparing for possible threats. Although the exact nature of those threats remains uncertain, some scholars believe that internal conflicts between rival Mycenaean kingdoms may have contributed to rising tensions. By around 1200 BC, the palace system that had sustained Mycenaean civilization for centuries began collapsing. Archaeological layers at sites such as Pylos and Mycenaean revealed widespread destruction caused by fires that destroyed palace buildings and administrative archives. Clay tablets discovered at Pylos were preserved only because the fire that destroyed the palace baked them into hardened ceramic, allowing modern scholars to read the final administrative records produced by the Mycenaean scribes. These tablets provide a glimpse into the last days of the palace administration. Some of them contain references to military preparations, including the mobilization of coastal defenses. Officials appear to have been organizing resources and personnel in response to an expected threat, possibly from groups arriving by sea. Although the exact identity of these attackers remains uncertain, the records indicate that the palace authorities were aware that danger was approaching. After the destruction of the major palaces, the centralized system that had governed Mycenaean society disappeared. Without these administrative centers, the economic networks that connected agriculture, trade, and craft production began to break down. Smaller settlements continued to exist across Greece, but the large palace-based kingdoms no longer dominated the region. The collapse of the Mycenaean palace system had long-lasting consequences. Writing using linear B disappeared for several centuries, and many aspects of the complex administrative culture of the Bronze Age were lost. This period is sometimes referred to as the Greek Dark Age, a time when urban centers declined and the population of the region became more rural and decentralized. The fall of the Mycenaean kingdoms shows how rapidly a complex civilization can unravel when its central institutions are destroyed, just like the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. The Mycenaean world had appeared powerful and stable for generations. Yet within a relatively short period of time, its political and economic structures collapsed. In the next part, we examine the destruction of key cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast, including the once thriving trade center of Ugarit, whose final written messages provide one of the most dramatic records of the Bronze Age collapse. While the Hittite Empire was collapsing in Anatolia and the Mycenaean palaces were burning across Greece, another dramatic episode was unfolding along the eastern Mediterranean coast. One of the most prosperous trading cities of the late Bronze Age, Ugarit, suddenly faced destruction. Located in what is now modern Syria, Ugarit had flourished for centuries as a commercial hub connecting major civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East. Ugarit's strategic position allowed it to play an important role in the international trade system of the late Bronze Age. Merchants arriving in its ports brought goods from regions such as Cyprus, Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Ships unloaded copper ingots, luxury textiles, precious stones, and agricultural products that were redistributed through inland trade routes. The city's prosperity depended heavily on these maritime connections, and its rulers maintained diplomatic relationships with many of the powerful kingdoms surrounding it. Archaeological excavations at Ugarit have uncovered archives containing thousands of clay tablets written in several languages. These documents include administrative records, religious texts, and diplomatic correspondence with neighboring states. Among these tablets are a series of letters written during the final days of the city, providing one of the most vivid glimpses into the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. One particularly striking letter appears to have been written by a local official urgently requesting military assistance. In the message, the writer warns that enemy forces have been sighted along the coast and that the city's defenses are not prepared for the coming attack. The tone of the letter suggests a sense of desperation, as if the author understood that help might not arrive in time. Another message describes enemy ships approaching while the city's main military forces were away, leaving the population vulnerable. These tablets are especially dramatic because they were never sent or answered. When archaeologists discovered them centuries later, they were still sitting in the archives where scribes had stored them before the city's destruction. This suggests that the attack happened so quickly that normal administrative communication broke down entirely. Whatever forces were approaching the city arrived before Ugarit could organize an effective defense. Excavations at the site confirm that the city was violently destroyed around 1190 BCE. Layers of burned buildings and collapsed structures indicate that fires swept through the urban center. leaving large areas of the city in ruins. After this destruction, Ugarit was never rebuilt as a major urban center. The trade networks that had once supported its economy disappeared along with the broader system, connecting the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The destruction of Ugarit illustrates how quickly the Bronze Age system was unraveling. A city that had once thrived as a central hub of international trade was suddenly abandoned. Diplomatic connections failed, military support never arrived, and the administrative institutions that had organized the city's economy vanished almost overnight. What makes the fall of Ugarit particularly significant is its timing. The destruction occurred during the same decades when the Hittite Empire collapsed and Mycenaean palaces were destroyed in Greece. The coincidence of these events suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean was experiencing a widespread crisis affecting multiple regions simultaneously. In the next part, we examine how these individual collapses combined into a broader regional breakdown that transformed the ancient world and marked the end of the Bronze Age. By the final decades of the 12th century BCE, it had become clear that the destruction of individual cities was not an isolated series of events. Instead, the entire network that had connected the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean was breaking apart. Within a relatively short span of time, major powers that had dominated the Bronze Age world for centuries either disappeared completely or were severely weakened. The collapse of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Mycenaean palace centers, and the fall of coastal cities like Ugarit were all part of a broader transformation that reshaped the political landscape of the region. What made this collapse so unusual was its scale and speed. Many of the cities affected had been important centers of power for generations. Their economies were supported by organized administrations, large agricultural systems, and extensive trade connections. Yet once key parts of the system began to fail, the effects spread quickly through the network that connected these societies. One important factor was the breakdown of international trade routes. As cities were destroyed and political authority weakened, the maritime and overland routes that had carried goods across the Mediterranean became increasingly unreliable. Ships that once transported copper, tin, and luxury goods between ports now faced greater risks from conflict, piracy, or unstable coastal regions. Without these trade networks, the production of bronze tools and weapons became more difficult, affecting both agriculture and military capabilities. The collapse of palace administrations also played a major role. In societies such as the Mycenaean kingdoms, the palace served as the center of economic organization. It coordinated labor, managed agricultural storage, and distributed resources across the population. When these palace complexes were destroyed, the administrative systems that supported them disappeared as well. Without centralized authority, local communities often reverted to smaller, less complex forms of organization. Population movements likely intensified these disruptions. As cities burned or agricultural production declined, groups of people may have migrated in search of safer or more fertile territories. These migrations could place additional pressure on regions already struggling with food shortages or political instability. In some cases, these movements may have contributed to the attacks described in Egyptian inscriptions associated with the Sea Peoples. The combination of these factors created what historians sometimes describe as a systemic collapse, rather than a single cause triggering the downfall of the Bronze Age civilizations. Multiple stresses interacted with one another. Environmental pressures, internal conflicts, economic disruptions, and military threats all occurred within a tightly connected network of societies. Once several parts of this system began to fail at the same time, the entire structure became unstable. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean had changed dramatically. Many of the powerful kingdoms that once dominated the region had disappeared. Cities that had been centers of international trade were abandoned or reduced to smaller settlements. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age had come to an end. In the next act, we examine how some civilizations, particularly Egypt, managed to survive the crisis, even as the broader Bronze Age system collapsed around them. While kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean were collapsing, one major civilization managed to survive the crisis, at least for a time. That civilization was Egypt. During the Late Bronze Age, Egypt was ruled by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, a period when Egyptian power extended beyond the Nile Valley into parts of the Levant. Egyptian armies maintained garrisons in important cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast, helping secure trade routes and political alliances that connected Egypt to the wider Bronze Age world. By the late 13th century BCE, Egypt had already experienced major conflicts with rival powers. One of the most famous examples was the confrontation between Egypt and the Hittite Empire during the reign of Ramesses II. The two great states fought the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. Although neither side achieved a decisive victory, the conflict eventually led to a diplomatic agreement, often considered one of the earliest known peace treaties. This treaty allowed Egypt and the Hittites to maintain a balance of power across the region. However, by the early 12th century BCE, the situation had changed dramatically. The Hittite Empire had collapsed, Mycenaean kingdoms were disappearing, and many coastal cities in the Levant were being destroyed. Egypt now faced the growing instability of a world where former allies and trading partners were no longer able to maintain their territories. As the network of Bronze Age states weakened, Egypt increasingly found itself confronting new threats. Without the support of the international system that had once provided stability, Egyptian records from this period suggest that the kingdom was under increasing pressure from both internal and external challenges. Maintaining control over distant territories required constant military presence and logistical support. As conditions deteriorated across the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt began withdrawing from some of its foreign holdings in the Levant. The pharaohs focused more on defending the Nile Valley itself, rather than maintaining the wide network of alliances that had once connected Egypt to neighboring states. The reign of Ramesses III, who ruled in the early 12th century BC, would become one of the most important moments in Egypt's struggle to survive the broader collapse. Ramesses III inherited a kingdom that was still powerful, but increasingly surrounded by instability. Egyptian inscriptions from his reign described large movements of people approaching Egyptian territory from both land and sea. These inscriptions appear on the walls of temples such as Medinet Habu, where relief carvings depict dramatic battles between Egyptian forces and invading groups. The scenes show fleets of ships clashing along the Nile Delta and Egyptian soldiers fighting enemies, armed with distinctive weapons and clothing unfamiliar to the Egyptians. The inscriptions identify these invaders as part of the same mysterious groups that modern historians refer to as the Sea Peoples. According to the Egyptian accounts, these groups were not simply raiding parties, but large migrating populations, traveling with families and possessions. Some inscriptions claim that entire regions to the north had already been devastated by these movements before the invaders reached Egypt's borders. If these descriptions are accurate, Egypt was facing not only military threats, but also large-scale population movements, triggered by the collapse of neighboring societies. The Egyptian government responded by preparing its defenses. Fortifications were strengthened, armies were mobilized, and fleets were positioned to protect the Nile Delta from seaborne attacks. The survival of Egypt during this period would depend on whether these preparations were enough to withstand the forces approaching from the Mediterranean. In the next part, we examine the battles described in Egyptian records and how Ramesses III attempted to stop the Sea Peoples from entering Egyptian territory. By the time Ramesses III came to the Egyptian throne in the early 12th century BCE, the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean had already been transformed. Powerful states that had once formed the backbone of the late Bronze Age world had collapsed or were rapidly declining. Cities that had maintained trade and diplomatic relationships with Egypt were no longer stable partners. Into this unstable environment came the groups that Egyptian records identify as the Sea Peoples. The most detailed description of these confrontations appears in relief carvings and inscriptions at the temple complex of Medinet Habu, built by Ramesses III near the ancient city of Thebes. These inscriptions portray dramatic scenes of warfare, showing Egyptian soldiers defending their homeland against invading forces, arriving by both land and sea. The visual reliefs are among the most vivid surviving depictions of warfare from the ancient world. According to the inscriptions, the Sea Peoples had already moved through several regions before reaching Egypt. The texts describe a chain of devastation affecting territories across Anatolia, the Levant, and parts of the eastern Mediterranean coast. Cities that had once been part of powerful kingdoms were reportedly destroyed, and large groups of migrants were moving southward toward Egyptian territory. Ramesses III's government prepared carefully for the expected confrontation. Egyptian forces fortified positions along the Nile Delta, the region where invading fleets would likely attempt to land. At the same time, Egyptian naval units were organized to intercept enemy ships approaching from the Mediterranean. This preparation suggests that Egyptian authorities had gathered intelligence about the movements of these groups and understood that the coming conflict would involve both land and naval warfare. The battle scenes carved into the walls of Medinet Habu show Egyptian archers positioned along the riverbanks, firing arrows at approaching enemy ships. The reliefs depict chaotic naval combat as vessels collide and warriors attempt to board each other's ships. Egyptian forces appear to have used the geography of the Nile Delta to their advantage, trapping enemy ships in narrow waterways where they could be attacked from multiple directions. Another series of scenes shows battles on land, where Egyptian infantry confront invading warriors equipped with round shields, spears, and distinctive feathered helmets. These images have become one of the primary visual references historians use when discussing the Sea Peoples. While Egyptian artwork often exaggerates the victories of its rulers, the detailed depiction suggests that the battles were intense and involved large numbers of combatants. According to Ramesses III's inscriptions, the Egyptian army succeeded in defeating these invading forces. The texts claim that the Sea Peoples were driven back or captured, preventing them from establishing control within the Nile Valley. Prisoners taken during these battles were reportedly settled in Egyptian-controlled territories, possibly serving as laborers or soldiers within the Egyptian system. Although Egyptian sources present these battles as decisive victories, they also reveal how serious the threat had become. Egypt was forced to mobilize significant military resources to defend its borders, at a time when the broader Bronze Age system was already collapsing. Even if Egypt successfully repelled these invasions, the kingdom could not escape the long-term consequences of the regional crisis. In the next part, we examined how the collapse of neighboring civilizations continued affecting Egypt's economy and political stability in the decades following these battles. Although Ramesses III succeeded in defending Egypt from the invading groups described in the inscriptions at Medinet, the kingdom did not emerge from the Bronze Age collapse completely unaffected. The battles against the Sea Peoples may have prevented immediate conquest, but the broader international system that had supported Egypt's power for centuries was now gone. Trade routes were disrupted, former allies had disappeared, and the economic balance that had sustained the late Bronze Age world was permanently altered. For generations, Egypt had benefited from its connections to the wider Eastern Mediterranean network. Egyptian merchants imported materials from distant regions, including copper from Cyprus, tin used for bronze production, timber from the Levant, and luxury goods from various trading partners. These materials were essential not only for crafting tools and weapons, but also for maintaining the prestige of the royal court. As neighboring kingdoms collapsed and maritime trade routes became less secure, obtaining these resources became increasingly difficult. The loss of stable trade connections placed pressure on Egypt's economy. Without reliable access to imported materials, industries that depended on bronze production faced shortages. Although Egypt still possessed strong agricultural resources along the Nile, the broader economic system that had connected it to the rest of the Bronze Age world was deteriorating. The effects of this disruption were not immediate, but over time, they began to weaken the foundations of the Egyptian state. Internal tensions also began to emerge within Egyptian society during the reign of Ramesses III. One of the most remarkable historical records from this period describes what is often considered the first documented labor strike in recorded history. Workers responsible for constructing royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings stopped working because they had not received their grain rations on time. These workers were highly skilled artisans who depended on the government's system of food distribution. When that system failed to provide their supplies, they protested by refusing to continue their work. The records of this strike reveal that the Egyptian administration was struggling to maintain the supply networks that supported its workforce. Delays in delivering grain and other essential goods suggests that the economic disruptions affecting the region were beginning to impact daily life, even within Egypt itself. Although the strike was eventually resolved, it demonstrated that the government's ability to manage resources was becoming less reliable. Political tensions also appeared within the royal court late in Ramesses III's reign. Evidence suggests that a conspiracy may have formed among members of the palace household. Documents discovered in later periods describe what historians refer to as the harem conspiracy, an attempted plot to assassinate the pharaoh and replace him with another heir. While the details of this event remain uncertain, the surviving records indicate that several individuals within the royal court were accused and punished for their involvement. These internal challenges illustrate that even though Egypt survived the initial wave of destruction that affected other Bronze Age civilizations, it was still deeply affected by the collapse of the wider system. Economic pressures, administrative difficulties, and political intrigue all became more common as the kingdom adjusted to a world that had changed dramatically. In the next part, we examine how Egypt gradually withdrew from its international role and entered a new historical period following the end of the Bronze Age. Although Egypt survived the immediate military threats of the early 12th century BC, the world around it had changed in ways that could not easily be reversed. The international system that had defined the late Bronze Age for centuries was gone. Former powers such as the Hittite Empire had disappeared. The Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece had collapsed, and many of the coastal cities that once served as trading partners were destroyed or abandoned. Egypt remained standing, but it now existed in a much smaller and more isolated political landscape. The pharaohs of the new kingdom had once controlled territories far beyond the Nile Valley, maintaining influence across parts of the Levant through military garrisons and diplomatic alliances. After the Bronze Age collapse, maintaining these distant territories became increasingly difficult. Without the stability of the broader international network, Egypt gradually withdrew from many of its foreign possessions. Regions that had once been under Egyptian influence became independent or taken over by new groups migrating into the area. The economic consequences of this shift were significant. Egypt had long benefited from its role within a large system of trade that connected the Mediterranean world. With many of these connections disrupted, the flow of goods into Egypt decreased. Materials such as copper, tin, and timber became harder to obtain, affecting industries that depended on imported resources. Although the Nile Valley still provided fertile agricultural land, the loss of international trade reduced Egypt's access to the wider economic network that had once supported its wealth. Over time, the political strength of the Egyptian state also began to decline. The later rulers following Ramesses III faced increasing difficulties maintaining centralized control. Administrative systems became less effective, and regional officials gained more independence from the royal government. Temples and religious institutions accumulated growing influence, sometimes controlling large portions of land and resources that had previously been managed directly by the state. These changes did not happen overnight. Egypt continued to exist as a functioning kingdom, and its cultural traditions remained strong. However, historians often view this period as the end of Egypt's imperial age. The pharaohs would no longer dominate the eastern Mediterranean, as they had during the height of the New Kingdom. Instead, Egypt entered a new phase in which its influence became more limited and its political power more fragmented. At the same time, new societies were beginning to emerge in the regions affected by the collapse. Levant groups that had once been minor populations began establishing new settlements and identities. Some scholars connect the Palisat, mentioned in Egyptian records among the Sea Peoples, with the later Philistines who settled along the southern coast of Canaan. These communities would become part of the changing political landscape of the early Iron Age. The transformation of the eastern Mediterranean during this period marked the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Technologies changed, trade patterns shifted, and new kingdoms eventually rose from the ruins of the earlier civilizations. Although the collapse had been devastating, it also created conditions that allowed new cultures and political systems to develop. In the next act, we explore how the Mediterranean world slowly reorganized itself after the collapse, and how new societies began shaping the early Iron Age. When the wave of destruction that marked the Bronze Age collapse finally passed, the Eastern Mediterranean looked very different from the world that had existed only a few generations earlier. Cities that had once been centers of international trade were reduced to ruins. Palace administrations that had organized economies and governments for centuries had disappeared. The complex network connecting Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the coastal city-states had broken apart, leaving behind a fragmented landscape of smaller communities struggling to adapt. Archaeological evidence from across the region shows how widespread this transformation was. In Mani Plus's large urban centers were abandoned or drastically reduced in size. Excavations at former palace sites in Greece revealed that after their destruction, the massive administrative complexes were not rebuilt. Instead, smaller settlements appeared nearby, often without the centralized political structures that had once dominated the Mycenaean world. Without palace administrations to coordinate agriculture, trade, and labor, the economies of these regions became more localized and less complex. The same pattern can be observed along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Cities that had served as important commercial hubs during the late Bronze Age lost their central role within the international trading system. Some were rebuilt on a smaller scale, while others remained abandoned for generations. The disappearance of large palace economies meant that many of the administrative and commercial networks that had once connected these cities were no longer functioning. This transition affected everyday life for ordinary people. In the earlier Bronze Age system, palace administrations had often coordinated large agricultural projects, managed food storage, and distributed resources to workers. With the collapse of these institutions, local communities had to reorganize their economies around smaller, more decentralized systems. Farming continued, but agricultural production was often managed by individual households or small villages rather than centralized governments. Trade did not disappear entirely, but it changed significantly. Instead of large-scale international exchange managed by powerful kingdoms, trade became more regional. Smaller merchant networks connected neighboring communities, exchanging goods such as pottery, tools, and agricultural products. Long-distance trade across the Mediterranean became far less common during the early centuries following the collapse. Population patterns also shifted. In some areas, groups of people moved away from vulnerable coastal regions or large urban centers and settled in smaller inland communities. These settlements were often easier to defend and required fewer resources to maintain. The movement of populations during this period contributed to the emergence of new cultural identities across different parts of the Mediterranean world. Although the collapse had destroyed many of the political and economic systems of the Bronze Age, it did not bring an end to human civilization in the region. Instead, it marked the beginning of a transitional period in which societies gradually reorganized themselves under new conditions. Over time, these changes would give rise to new technologies, new political structures, and new cultural traditions. In the next part, we examine how one particular technological development, growing use of iron, began reshaping societies. During the early centuries of the New Age, in the centuries following the collapse of the Bronze Age system, one technological shift gradually began reshaping societies across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. This development was the increasing use of iron as a material for tools and weapons. While iron had been known during the Bronze Age, it had been relatively rare and difficult to produce in large quantities. After the collapse disrupted the international trade networks that supplied copper and tin for bronze production, communities began experimenting more extensively with iron as an alternative. Producing bronze required a steady supply of both copper and tin, which often had to be transported over long distances through complex trade routes. When these routes broke down during the Bronze Age collapse, access to these metals became unreliable. In contrast, iron ore was more widely available in many regions. Although the process of smelting iron required higher temperatures and different techniques, communities gradually learned how to work with this new material. At first, iron tools were not necessarily superior to bronze. Early ironworking techniques often produced metal that was softer or more brittle than high-quality bronze. However, the advantage of iron was its availability. Because iron ore could be found in more locations than tin, communities were able to produce tools and weapons without depending on long-distance trade networks. Over time, improvements in ironworking techniques made the metal stronger and more reliable. The spread of iron technology occurred gradually rather than suddenly. Archaeological evidence suggests that iron tools became increasingly common between 1100 BCE and 900 BCE. As blacksmiths gained more experience working with the material, iron weapons and agricultural tools began replacing bronze in many areas. This technological transition marks the beginning of what historians refer to as the Iron Age. The shift to iron had important consequences for both agriculture and warfare. Iron tools, such as plows and sickles, made farming more efficient in some regions, allowing communities to cultivate new types of land that had previously been difficult to work. In warfare, iron weapons eventually provided advantages in durability and production. Armies could equip larger numbers of soldiers because iron resources were more widely available than the materials required for bronze. The spread of ironworking also contributed to changes in political organization. During the Bronze Age, large centralized states often controlled access to metal resources and managed production through palace administrations. In the early Iron Age, smaller communities could sometimes produce their own tools and weapons locally. This shift reduced the dependence on centralized palace economies and allowed more decentralized societies to emerge. These developments helped shape the political and cultural transformations that followed the Bronze Age collapse. As new technologies spread and trade patterns changed, different societies began establishing new centers of power across the Mediterranean world. Some regions that had been peripheral during the Bronze Age would soon become influential in the centuries that followed. In the next part, we examine how new cultures and kingdoms began emerging in the Eastern Mediterranean during the early Iron Age. As the Eastern Mediterranean slowly adjusted to the disruptions of the Bronze Age collapse, the political landscape began to reorganize in ways that would shape the early Iron Age. The disappearance of powerful Bronze Age kingdoms created opportunities for new groups and emerging societies to establish themselves in regions that had once been dominated by older empires over several generations. These changes produced a new map of cultures and kingdoms across the Mediterranean and the Near East. One of the most visible examples of this transformation occurred along the southern coast of the Levant, where archaeological evidence suggests that new populations settled in areas previously connected to Egyptian-controlled territories. Among these groups were the Philistines, who appear in historical records not long after the period associated with the Sea Peoples. Excavations in cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron revealed distinctive pottery styles and architectural features that differ from earlier local traditions, suggesting that these communities had cultural connections to regions of the Aegean world. The Philistines established a group of city-states along the coastal plain of Canaan, forming what later texts describe as a pentapolis, or alliance of 5 major cities. These communities became important participants in regional trade and agriculture. During the early Iron Age, their presence also played a role in the shifting political dynamics of the region, interacting with neighboring populations that would eventually form the kingdoms described in later historical sources. At the same time, inland areas of the Levant saw the gradual emergence of new societies that had previously existed as smaller tribal communities. Archaeological surveys have identified hundreds of small villages appearing in the highlands of Canaan. During the early Iron Age, many of these settlements were modest farming communities that relied on local agriculture rather than large palace-based economies. Over time, these villages would develop into more organized political structures that later traditions associate with the early kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Further north, Other societies were also adapting to the new conditions created by the collapse. In Anatolia, the region once dominated by the Hittite Empire fragmented into smaller states, often referred to as Neo-Hittite kingdoms. These communities preserved elements of earlier Hittite culture while operating on a smaller political scale. Their cities served as local centers of trade and administration within the changing landscape of the Iron Age. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, older traditions continued to evolve, as new powers slowly began reasserting control over parts of the region. Cities that had survived the earlier collapse remained important cultural centers, and over time larger states would once again emerge along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Although the political map of the Near East had changed dramatically, the region's long tradition of urban civilization remained an important foundation for future empires. The emergence of these new societies demonstrates that the Bronze Age collapse was not simply an ending, but also a period of transformation. While older systems of centralized palace economies disappeared, smaller and more flexible political structures began taking their place. These societies operated with different economic patterns, technologies, and social organizations compared to the kingdoms that had dominated the late Bronze Age. Over the following centuries, some of these emerging cultures would grow into influential civilizations that shaped the history of the Mediterranean world. The process was gradual, but it marked the beginning of a new historical era that would eventually produce powerful kingdoms and new cultural traditions. In the next part, we conclude this act by examining how the Eastern Mediterranean slowly stabilized after the collapse, and how the foundations of the Iron Age world were established. The centuries following the Bronze Age collapse were not a time of immediate recovery. Instead, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a long transitional period in which societies gradually adapted to a world without the powerful, palace-centered kingdoms that had once dominated the region. Trade networks were smaller, political systems were more localized, and populations were often organized into villages or modest city-states rather than large empires. Yet, over time, these new conditions allowed the foundations of the Iron Age world to take shape. One of the most important differences between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age was the scale of political organization. The earlier system had been dominated by large, centralized states, such as the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace kingdoms. In contrast, the early Iron Age was characterized by smaller political units that were often more flexible and less dependent on complex international trade networks. These smaller states could sometimes adapt more easily to changing conditions, especially when agricultural production became the primary economic foundation. The spread of iron technology played an important role in this transformation. As iron tools and weapons became more common, communities were able to produce essential equipment locally rather than relying on distant trade routes for bronze materials. This shift reduced the dependence on large, centralized trade systems and allowed many regions to become more economically self-sufficient. Farmers could produce tools for agriculture within their own communities, and local craftsmen developed new methods for working iron into durable implements. Gradually, trade across the Mediterranean began to expand again, although it looked very different from the trade networks of the Bronze Age. Instead of a system controlled by powerful palace administrations, maritime trade during the early Iron Age was often conducted by independent merchants and smaller cities. Ports along the Levantine coast began re-establishing connections with neighboring regions, exchanging agricultural goods, metals, and crafted objects. One group that became particularly influential in this renewed maritime trade was the Phoenicians, a seafaring culture based in cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Along the Levantine coast, the Phoenicians developed advanced shipbuilding and navigation techniques that allowed them to establish trading colonies across the Mediterranean. Over time, their networks connected regions as distant as North Africa, Spain, and parts of the central Mediterranean, helping restore long-distance exchange that had been disrupted during the collapse. Cultural and technological developments also continued during this period. Writing systems evolved as societies adapted earlier traditions to new languages and administrative needs. In some regions, alphabetic scripts began replacing the more complex writing systems used during the Bronze Age. These new writing methods were simpler and easier to learn, making literacy more accessible to a wider portion of the population. By the early first millennium BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean had entered a new historical phase. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was different from the one that had existed before it. The large empires of the late Bronze Age had vanished, but in their place new societies were growing, societies that would eventually produce the civilizations of classical Greece, Phoenicia, and later the powerful empires of the Near East. The collapse had been a period of profound disruption, yet it also created opportunities for transformation. Technologies changed, new cultures emerged, and political systems evolved in ways that would shape the next chapters of ancient history. In the next act, we step back to examine the broader historical significance of the Bronze Age collapse and what it reveals about how complex civilizations can rise, connect, and sometimes suddenly fall. When historians first began studying the destruction layers across cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, the question seems simple: what caused the Bronze Age collapse? For many years, scholars searched for a single explanation: an invasion, a natural disaster, or a political revolution that could account for the sudden disappearance of multiple civilizations. Yet as archaeological discoveries expanded and new scientific evidence became available, it became clear that the collapse was not the result of one event. Instead, it appears to have been the outcome of several interconnected pressures that together destabilized the entire late Bronze Age system. One of the most important factors was the interconnected nature of Bronze Age civilizations. By the 13th century BCE, many societies around the Eastern Mediterranean had become deeply linked through trade, diplomacy, and shared technologies. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant regions, grain shipments from agricultural centers, and luxury goods from royal courts all circulated through a network that connected Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaean kingdoms, and numerous coastal cities. This network created prosperity, but also introduced vulnerability. If disruptions occurred in one region, the effects could quickly spread throughout the entire system. Environmental stress appears to have been one of the early pressures affecting this network. Climate studies based on pollen samples, lake sediments, and geological records indicate that several areas experienced periods of drought during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Reduced rainfall would have lowered agricultural yields, placing stress on food supplies that supported large urban populations. When harvests declined, governments faced difficulties maintaining grain storage systems and providing food rations to workers and soldiers. Economic disruptions followed closely behind these environmental pressures. Trade routes that had carried metals, food, and manufactured goods across the Mediterranean became less reliable as political instability increased. Without consistent supplies of tin, which was necessary for producing bronze, many societies faced shortages in tools and weapons. Since bronze production depended on materials from distant regions, any disruption in the trade network could quickly affect entire industries. Internal political tensions also contributed to instability within several kingdoms. Large palace administrations had controlled much of the economic activity during the Bronze Age, organizing labor and managing agricultural resources. When these centralized systems encountered difficulties, whether from food shortages, leadership disputes, or external threats, their ability to maintain order weakened. Once a palace center collapsed, the entire economic structure connected to it could rapidly disintegrate. Another factor likely involved large-scale population movements. Archaeological evidence and written records suggest that groups of people migrated across the Mediterranean during this period, possibly searching for more stable environments after drought or conflict affected their homelands. Some of these groups may have been responsible for attacks on coastal cities, while others settled in new regions and established communities that would become important parts of the Iron Age world. These different pressures, environmental stress, economic disruption, political instability, and migration, did not occur independently. Instead, they interacted with one another in ways that amplified their effects. A drought could reduce food production, which might lead to political unrest. Political unrest could weaken military defenses, making cities vulnerable to attacks or migrations. Once trade routes were disrupted, obtaining essential resources became even more difficult. Understanding the Bronze Age collapse therefore requires viewing it as a systemic failure rather than a single catastrophic event. The civilizations of the late Bronze Age had become so interconnected that when multiple stresses appeared at the same time, the entire network struggled to survive. In the next part, we examine how modern archaeology and scientific research continue uncovering new evidence that helps historians understand this complex historical transformation. For many years, the destruction of Bronze Age cities was known primarily through ancient inscriptions and scattered archaeological discoveries. Early excavations revealed burned buildings and abandoned settlements, but it was difficult to determine whether these events were connected or simply isolated local disasters. Over time, however, advances in archaeology and scientific research have allowed historians to reconstruct the broader patterns behind the collapse with much greater detail. One of the most important sources of evidence comes from archaeological destruction layers found at numerous sites across the eastern Mediterranean. Excavations in places such as Ugarit, Mycenaean, and several cities in Anatolia reveal similar patterns. Buildings destroyed by intense fires, collapsed palace structures, and abrupt endings to administrative records. In many of these locations, the destruction appears to have occurred within a relatively narrow time frame around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. These archaeological layers provide important clues about how the collapse unfolded. In some cities, there are clear signs of violent attacks, including weapons, burned walls, and evidence of hurried abandonment. In others, the destruction appears to have followed periods of decline or economic stress. The variation between sites suggests that different regions experienced the collapse in different ways, even though the overall transformation affected the entire Mediterranean world. Scientific research has also provided new insights into the environmental conditions of the period. Studies of pollen samples preserved in ancient sediments allow researchers to reconstruct changes in vegetation and rainfall patterns over long periods of time. In several parts of the eastern Mediterranean, these studies indicate a noticeable shift toward drier conditions during the late Bronze Age. Reduced rainfall would have placed additional pressure on agricultural societies that depended on stable seasonal cycles. Another important source of evidence comes from tree ring analysis, also known as DIP. By examining the growth patterns preserved in ancient wood samples, scientists can identify years when trees experienced stress due to drought or other environmental factors. In some regions, these records suggest that several consecutive years of poor growing conditions may have occurred during the decades leading up to the Bronze Age collapse. These scientific findings help explain why agricultural systems may have struggled during this period. If rainfall declined across multiple regions at the same time, harvests would have been smaller and food supplies more limited. Urban populations that depended on large agricultural surpluses would have faced increasing difficulties maintaining stable food distribution systems. Archaeologists have also discovered evidence of abandoned settlements and population movements during the early Iron Age. Surveys of ancient landscapes show that some regions experienced declines in large urban centers, while smaller villages appeared in new locations. These changes suggest that communities were reorganizing themselves after the collapse of centralized palace economies. Together, archaeological discoveries and scientific research have helped historians build a more complete picture of the Bronze Age collapse. Instead of a single catastrophic event, the evidence points to a complex combination of environmental pressures, economic disruptions, political instability, and migrations that gradually weakened the interconnected system of the late Bronze Age. In the next part, we explore how historians interpret this event as one of the earliest examples of systemic collapse in complex civilizations, a concept that continues to influence modern discussions about resilience and vulnerability in interconnected societies. As historians continued examining the evidence from archaeology, ancient texts, and environmental studies, a new interpretation of the Bronze Age collapse began to emerge. Instead of viewing the event as a series of unrelated disasters, many scholars now see it as one of the earliest examples of what is known as a systemic collapse. This concept describes a situation in which a complex and interconnected system fails because multiple pressures occur at the same time, overwhelming the structures that normally maintain stability. During the Late Bronze Age, the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean were more interconnected than many earlier societies had been. Trade networks linked regions separated by hundreds of kilometers, while diplomatic alliances connected royal courts across the Near East. Administrative systems and palace centers coordinated agriculture, craft production, and long-distance exchange. These connections created prosperity, but they also introduced a level of dependence that made the system vulnerable when disruptions began to appear. One way to understand this vulnerability is to consider how essential certain materials were to Bronze Age societies. Bronze production required both copper and tin, two metals that rarely occurred together in the same region. Copper was mined in places such as Cyprus, while tin had to be transported from distant locations through long trade routes. If those routes were interrupted, whether by political conflict, migration, or environmental disruption, entire industries could suffer shortages. Without bronze tools and weapons, agricultural productivity and military strength could decline. The same principle applied to food production and trade. Mani? Buronsi. 8 cities relied on centralized storage systems that collected grain from surrounding farmland and redistributed it to workers and soldiers. If drought reduced agricultural output or political instability disrupted the distribution process, these systems could quickly fail. Once food shortages appeared, populations might migrate in search of more stable conditions, placing additional pressure on neighboring regions. Political structures within these civilizations were also highly centralized. Palace administrations controlled large segments of the economy and coordinated labor across extensive territories. While this organization allowed rulers to manage complex societies efficiently during stable periods, it also meant that the collapse of a palace center could destabilize an entire region. When administrative archives were destroyed or abandoned, the networks of communication and control that supported the economy often disappeared with them. The interconnected nature of the Late Bronze Age world meant that problems in one region could affect others through a cascade of disruptions. For example, a drought might reduce harvests in one kingdom, forcing it to import grain from neighboring states. If those neighbors were also facing shortages or political unrest, they might be unable to provide assistance. Trade routes might become unsafe, leading to further economic strain. As these pressures accumulated, the stability of the entire system weakened. Historians sometimes compare this process to a network of connected structures, where the failure of one part increases the strain on the others. If several critical components fail at the same time, the entire system can collapse, even if each individual problem might have been manageable on its own. In the case of the Bronze Age world, environmental changes, migrations, internal conflicts, and disruptions in trade appear to have interacted in precisely this way. Understanding the collapse as a systemic failure helps explain why so many civilizations were affected simultaneously, rather than a single invading force destroying multiple kingdoms. The evidence suggests that the interconnected structure of the Late Bronze Age itself contributed to its vulnerability. Once the network began breaking apart, recovery became extremely difficult. In the next part, we conclude this act by examining what lessons historians draw from the Bronze Age collapse, and why this ancient event continues to attract attention from scholars studying complex societies. When historians study the destruction of the Late Bronze Age civilizations, they are not only examining an ancient historical mystery, they're also looking at one of the earliest documented examples of how complex societies can become vulnerable when many different pressures occur at the same time. The Bronze Age collapse provides a case study of how interconnected systems can function successfully for centuries, and then unravel when the conditions supporting them begin to change. One of the key lessons drawn from this event is the importance of interdependence. within complex networks. The civilizations of the Late Bronze Age had developed sophisticated trade routes, diplomatic alliances, and administrative systems that connected regions across the Mediterranean and Near East. These connections allowed goods, ideas, and resources to circulate efficiently. However, they also created dependencies that made societies vulnerable when those networks were disrupted. For example, many kingdoms depended on long-distance trade for essential materials such as tin, which was necessary for producing bronze. When political instability or migration disrupted these routes, entire industries could face shortages. Similarly, agricultural systems that supported large urban populations depended on predictable climate patterns. When environmental conditions shifted, governments were forced to manage food shortages that could lead to unrest and migration. Another important lesson concerns the centralization of power and administration. During the Bronze Age, palace economies concentrated political and economic authority in a relatively small number of administrative centers. These palaces coordinated labor, stored agricultural surpluses, and controlled trade networks. While this system allowed rulers to manage large territories effectively during periods of stability, it also meant that the destruction of a single palace complex could disrupt the economic life of an entire region. The collapse also illustrates how multiple stresses can interact in ways that amplify their effects. Environmental changes alone might not have destroyed the Bronze Age world. Migrations alone might not have ended the great kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. But when drought, economic disruption, political instability, and military conflict occurred simultaneously, the system that supported these civilizations became increasingly difficult to sustain. Modern resets continue investigating the Bronze Age collapse using new technologies and interdisciplinary approaches. Archaeology, climate, science, and historical analysis all contribute pieces of evidence that help explain how these events unfolded. Each new discovery adds detail to the story of how a thriving international network of civilizations transformed into a fragmented landscape of smaller societies. Despite the dramatic nature of the collapse, it is important to remember that human societies did not disappear. Communities adapted to new conditions, developed new technologies, such as iron, and reorganized themselves into new political structures. Over the centuries that followed, new cultures and kingdoms would emerge across the Mediterranean world. The Bronze Age collapse, therefore, represents both an ending and a beginning. It marked the conclusion of a long era dominated by palace-centered civilizations, but it also created the conditions that allowed the Iron Age world to develop. In the next act, we move toward the conclusion of this journey by examining how the memory of the Bronze Age world survived in later cultures and historical traditions. When the Bronze Age world collapsed around 1200 BC, the political systems that had connected the Eastern Mediterranean disappeared within only a few generations. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, and many writing systems stopped being used. Yet the memory of this earlier age did not vanish entirely. Instead, fragments of its history survived through stories, traditions, and later cultural developments that preserved echoes of the lost Bronze Age civilizations. One of the most interesting examples of this memory appears in ancient Greek tradition. Centuries after the destruction of the Mycenaean palace system, Greek poets began recording epic stories about heroic kings and great wars that had taken place in an earlier age. These stories eventually became part of the works attributed to Homer, including the famous epics the Iliad and the Odyssey. Although these texts were written down many centuries after the events they describe, many historians believe they preserve distant memories of the Mycenaean world. The story of the Trojan War, which plays a central role in the Greek epic tradition, may reflect historical conflicts that occurred during the Late Bronze Age. Archaeological excavations at the site, traditionally identified as Troy, located in northwestern Anatolia, revealed that the city experienced several layers of destruction during the 2nd millennium BCE. One of these destruction layers occurred close to the period associated with the Bronze Age collapse. While it is impossible to confirm that the legendary Trojan War happened exactly as described in Greek mythology, The archaeological evidence suggests that the region experienced significant conflict during this era. Greek epic traditions also describe powerful kings ruling fortified cities such as Mycenae and Tyrants, places that archaeologists later confirmed were indeed important palace centers. During the Bronze Age, these cities were surrounded by massive stone walls that later Greek travelers believed had been built by mythical giants known as the Cyclopi. In reality, these walls were constructed by the Mycenaean rulers who governed the region centuries before the Greek epics were written. The survival of these stories demonstrates how cultural memory can preserve fragments of historical events, even when written records disappear. After the Mycenaean palace system collapsed, the linear B-writing system used by Mycenaean administrators fell out of use. For several centuries, Greece entered a period with little written documentation. Yet oral traditions continued circulating among communities, passing down stories of earlier heroes and powerful kingdoms. Over time, these oral traditions evolved into the epic narratives that later became part of classical Greek literature. Although the stories contain mythological elements and dramatic embellishments, they may preserve distant echoes of the political and military conflicts that shaped the late Bronze Age world. The survival of these memories shows that even when civilizations collapse, their influence can persist through cultural traditions that outlast the institutions that originally created them. In the next part, we examine how other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean preserve their own memories of the Bronze Age world, while Greek epic poetry preserved distant memories of the Mycenaean world. Other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean also carried forward traditions rooted in the earlier Bronze Age civilizations. In the Near East, where writing systems continued to be used after the collapse, historical records, myths, and cultural practices preserved connections to the societies that had existed before the Great Upheaval. Of the 12th century BCE, in Mesopotamia, for example, scribal traditions remained remarkably resilient, even as political power shifted between different kingdoms. The scholarly institutions responsible for preserving literature and administrative knowledge continued operating. Scribes trained in temple schools copied texts that had originally been written centuries earlier during the Sumerian and Akkadian periods. These texts included religious hymns, legal codes, and historical narratives that recorded the achievements of earlier rulers. One of the most famous examples of this continuity is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that originated during the earlier Mesopotamian civilizations, but continued to be copied and studied long after the Bronze Age collapse. The epic tells the story of Gilgamesh, a legendary king of the city of Uruk, and his search for meaning and immortality. Although the narrative contains mythological elements, it also preserves details about the political and cultural world of early Mesopotamian cities. Through generations of scribal transmission, this story remained part of the intellectual tradition of the Near East. Other forms of cultural memory survived through religious traditions. Many of the gods worshipped during the Bronze Age continued to be honored in later periods, even as political structures changed. Temples dedicated to deities such as Baal, Ishtar, and Marduk remained important centers of community life. In many regions, rituals, festivals, and mythological stories helped preserve the cultural identity of societies that had experienced dramatic political transformations. In some cases, historical traditions were preserved through royal inscriptions created by later rulers who looked back to earlier civilizations as sources of legitimacy. Kings in the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods often referenced earlier rulers or ancient cities in their inscriptions, presenting themselves as heirs to long-standing traditions of kingship. By invoking the authority of past civilizations, these rulers reinforced the idea that their own governments were part of a continuous historical legacy. Archaeological evidence also reveals how material culture carried forward elements of earlier traditions. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, and religious symbols often show continuity between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. Even when political structures changed, everyday cultural practices frequently remained connected to the past. The persistence of these traditions demonstrates that the Bronze Age collapse did not erase the cultural foundations of the civilizations that had existed before it. Instead, many aspects of Bronze Age culture survived in modified forms within the societies that followed, through written texts, religious practices, and historical memory. The legacy of the earlier civilizations continued shaping the development of the Iron Age world. In the next part, we explore how later civilizations rediscovered the ruins of the Bronze Age and began interpreting them as remnants of a distant and mysterious past. As centuries passed, after the Bronze Age collapse, new civilizations emerged across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Yet the physical remains of the earlier world never completely disappeared. The ruins of great cities, massive fortifications, and abandoned palace complexes remained scattered across the landscape. Later generations encountered these structures and often struggled to understand who had built them or why they had been abandoned. In Greece, for example, the enormous stone walls surrounding ancient cities such as Mycenaean and Tiryns impressed later visitors with their scale. The blocks used in these fortifications were so large that classical Greek writers believed they could not have been constructed by ordinary humans. Instead, they attributed the walls to the work of mythical giants known as the Cyclopes, legendary beings said to possess enormous strength. Because of this belief, the walls of these ancient cities became known as Cyclopean walls. These interpretations show how the memory of the Bronze Age had faded over time. By the classical Greek period, the palace system that had governed Mycenaean society had disappeared for several centuries. Writing systems used by the Mycenaeans, such as Lineae B, had also been forgotten. Without written records explaining the origins of these structures, later cultures filled the gaps in knowledge with myths and legends. A similar pattern occurred in other parts of the Mediterranean world. In Anatolia, later inhabitants encountered the ruins of cities that had once been part of the Hittite Empire. The monumental gates, temples, and fortifications of sites such as Hattusa remained visible long after the empire itself had vanished. Although some cultural traditions survived in smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms, the memory of the large imperial state gradually faded. Along the Levantine coast, the remains of cities destroyed during the collapse became layers of archaeological history beneath later settlements. Over time, new communities rebuilt towns and cities on top of the earlier ruins, creating sites with multiple layers representing different historical periods. Each generation added new structures while remnants of earlier civilizations remained buried below. These ruins served as physical reminders that powerful societies had once existed in the region long before the rise of later civilizations such as classical Greece or the Persian Empire. Even when people no longer understood the full history behind these structures, the presence of monumental architecture suggested that earlier generations had achieved remarkable levels of organization and technological skill. It was not until the modern era, with the development of archaeology, that scholars began systematically uncovering and studying these ancient sites. Excavations during the 19th and 20th centuries revealed that the ruins described in myths and legends belonged to real civilizations that had flourished during the Bronze Age. Discoveries of palace complexes, administrative tablets, and city fortifications allowed historians to reconstruct the lost world that had once connected the Eastern Mediterranean. Through these discoveries, the ancient ruins encountered by later civilizations became key evidence for understanding the dramatic transformation that occurred around 1200 BCE. The burned cities, abandoned palaces, and disrupted trade networks, revealed by archaeologists, provide a detailed record of the events. The next part, we conclude this act by examining how the Bronze Age collapse reshaped the long-term development of Mediterranean civilizations. By the time the early Iron Age societies had fully developed, the world that had existed during the late Bronze Age was already several centuries in the past, yet the influence of that earlier era continued shaping the cultures that followed. Even though many of the great kingdoms had disappeared, the foundations they created, urban organization, trade traditions, writing systems, and political structures remained part of the historical inheritance of later civilizations. One of the most important ways this legacy survived was through technological and cultural continuity. Many tools, agricultural techniques, and craft traditions that had developed during the Bronze Age continued to be used by Iron Age societies. Pottery styles, architectural methods, and artistic symbols often evolved directly from earlier traditions rather than appearing suddenly as entirely new creations. This continuity shows that while political systems collapsed, everyday knowledge and cultural practices were passed from one generation to the next. The transformation of writing systems provides another example of how Bronze Age traditions influenced later cultures. During the Bronze Age, complex scripts such as cuneiform in Mesopotamia and Linear B in Mycenaean Greece were used primarily by specialized scribes working within palace administrations. After the collapse of these centralized institutions, new forms of writing began appearing that were easier to learn and more widely used. One of the most important developments was the spread of alphabetic writing, particularly through the influence of the Phoenician traders. These alphabets eventually became the basis for writing systems used by many later civilizations, including the Greeks and Romans. The political consequences of the collapse also shaped the course of Mediterranean history. In the centuries that followed, several new societies began rising to prominence in regions that had once been peripheral during the Bronze Age. Among them were the Phoenician city-states, whose maritime trade networks expanded across the Mediterranean. Their colonies and trading posts helped to reconnect distant regions and re-establish long-distance exchange that had been disrupted during the collapse. Meanwhile, in mainland Greece, the small communities that had replaced the Mycenaean palace kingdoms gradually developed into new political structures known as city-states or palaeus. These communities would eventually produce the classical Greek civilization known for its philosophy, political experiments, and cultural achievements. Although very different from the earlier Mycenaean world, these societies still existed in landscapes shaped by the ruins and traditions of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age collapse, therefore, did not erase the past completely. Instead, it created a historical transition in which older civilizations disappeared while new societies adapted and evolved from the remains of the previous system. The ruins of palaces and cities served as reminders that earlier generations had built complex and powerful states long before the rise of classical civilizations. Understanding this long continuity helps explain why the Bronze Age remains such an important chapter in human history. It represents the first large-scale international system connecting multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East. When that system collapsed, it reshaped the political and cultural development of the entire region for centuries to come. In the final act of this journey, we step back to examine the broader significance of the Bronze Age collapse and what it reveals about the rise and fall of interconnected civilizations. By the end of the 12th century BC, the world that had existed across the eastern Mediterranean for centuries was gone. The large political powers that had once dominated the region had either collapsed completely or been drastically weakened. The Hittite Empire had vanished from Anatolia, the Mycenaean palace kingdoms had disappeared from Greece, and major trade centers such as Ugarit had been destroyed. Egypt had survived, but it had withdrawn from its former international role. The interconnected system that historians call the Late Bronze Age world had effectively come to an end. What makes this transformation so significant is how interconnected that earlier system had been. For several centuries before the collapse, powerful kingdoms across the Mediterranean maintained diplomatic relationships, exchanged luxury goods, and coordinated trade routes that connected distant regions. Copper from Cyprus, tin from faraway sources, timber from the Levant, and agricultural products from fertile river valleys moved through a network of merchants, ships, and caravans. This network allowed civilizations separated by great distances to function as part of a shared economic and political environment. The collapse of this system did not occur in a single year or through a single catastrophic event. Instead, it unfolded over several decades as multiple pressures weakened the structures that had supported the Bronze Age world. Drought affected agricultural production in several regions. Political tensions destabilized large kingdoms, and migrations introduced new populations into areas already under strain. As trade networks became unreliable and palace administrations struggled to maintain order, cities that had once thrived began to decline. One of the most dramatic aspects of the collapse is how quickly complex systems can unravel once key institutions fail. Palace economies had coordinated large agricultural networks, stored surplus food, and organized trade. When these administrative centers were destroyed or abandoned, the systems that connected farmers, merchants, and craftsmen often disappeared with them. Communities that had once relied on centralized authority were suddenly forced to reorganize their economies at a much smaller scale. Yet the collapse did not mean that civilization itself ended. People continued farming, trading, and building communities. What changed was the structure of society. Large empires and palace-centered economies gave way to smaller, more localized systems. Over time, these smaller societies would develop new political forms and technologies that shaped the emerging Iron Age world. The Bronze Age collapse, therefore, represents a major turning point in the long history of the Mediterranean. It marked the end of one form of civilization and the beginning of another. Understanding this transformation helps explain why the centuries following the collapse produced societies that looked very different from the powerful kingdoms that had dominated the earlier era. In the final part of this journey, we conclude by reflecting on how the Bronze Age collapse reshaped the course of ancient history, and why historians continue studying this dramatic moment thousands of years later. When historians look back at the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, they often describe it as one of the most important turning points in ancient history. Around 1200 BCE, a network of powerful kingdoms that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries suddenly disappeared or transformed beyond recognition. Cities were destroyed, international trade collapsed, and political systems that had coordinated large societies ceased to function. Yet from the perspective of long-term history, this dramatic disruption was not only an ending, it also marked the beginning of a new historical era. The societies that emerged after the collapse were organized very differently from the palace-centered kingdoms of the late Bronze Age. Instead of large empires controlling extensive territories through centralized administrations, many regions were dominated by smaller kingdoms, city-states, and independent communities. These societies were often more localized and less dependent on complex international trade networks. While they lacked the large bureaucratic systems of the earlier age, they were also more adaptable to changing conditions. One of the most important developments during this new era was the expansion of iron technology. As communities learned to produce iron tools and weapons more effectively, the material gradually replaced bronze in many applications. Because iron ore was more widely available than tin, societies could manufacture tools and weapons without relying on distant trade routes. This shift helped reshape agriculture, warfare, and economic production across many parts of the Mediterranean and Near East. The collapse also created opportunities for new cultures and political systems to emerge. Along the Levantine coast, the Phoenicians developed powerful maritime trade networks that eventually reached across the Mediterranean. Their ships connected distant regions and helped restore long-distance exchange that had been disrupted during the collapse. In mainland Greece, the small communities that replaced the Mycenaean palace system gradually developed into the independent city-states that would later become central to classical Greek civilization. In the Near East, new empires would eventually rise from the remnants of earlier traditions. Kingdoms such as Assyria and later Babylon rebuilt political power in Mesopotamia, drawing on cultural foundations that had existed long before the Bronze Age collapse. These states developed military and administrative systems that allowed them to control large territories once again. Although the political landscape of the Iron Age looked very different from the earlier Bronze Age world, the Bronze Age collapse reminds us that civilizations are not permanent structures. They depend on networks of resources, political institutions, and environmental stability. When these supporting systems are disrupted, even powerful societies can face sudden transformation. Yet history also shows that human communities are capable of adapting to new conditions, creating new forms of organization after periods of crisis. Today, the ruins of Bronze Age cities across Greece, Turkey, Syria, and the Levant continue to provide evidence of this dramatic moment in history. Burned palace walls, abandoned trade centers, and forgotten administrative tablets reveal the story of a world that once connected multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean. Through archaeology and historical research, scholars continue piecing together how and why that world came to an end. The Bronze Age collapse, therefore, stands as both a warning and a reminder of resilience. It shows how interconnected societies can become vulnerable when multiple pressures appear at once. At the same time, it demonstrates how new cultures and technologies can emerge from the ruins of older systems, shaping the next chapters of human history.